Hello, welcome to my Toolbelt. This is Michael. Today we're going to talk about Loft, which is under the Surfaces menu here under the Surfaces module. If you click this pull down menu, you have Animation, Polygon, Surfaces, Surfaces what you want, and then the Surfaces menu. And you have lots of different options here, but we're going to go over Loft, the second one. And feel free to check out the Revolve video I've already done. So Loft, what is Loft? All these surfaces commands will use curves to create surfaces or shapes or meshes, however you want to refer to it. So first I'll need a curve because lofting requires curves to work. So I'm going to create CV curve tool, or you can use the EP curve tool, whichever you prefer if you have a preference. I'm going to go to the front view. I'm just going to click a bunch of times, make some wavy thing. Perspective view. So we got this. I'm going to hit Control D to duplicate this curve and move it over here. So I'm going to loft a surface between these two curves. So select one curve, shift select the other, doesn't matter which order in this case since I've only got two. Surfaces, loft, options. I'm going to hit Edit, Reset, just make sure we have our default values. Hide the grid. And hit Apply. And we have this. We get this surface kind of stretched between the two curves. Very cool, very handy for creating different kinds of things. And that's the general basics of how Loft works, but we're going to go over some more stuff as we always do. So I'm going to delete that surface for now, and let's create, I'm just going to duplicate this curve again and make 3 of them. Now the order that you select your curves when you have more than 2 matter. So I'm going to move this one down just so it's easier to see. So I got these 3 curves in this kind of V pattern. If I select this curve, shift select that curve second, and shift select that curve third, and hit Apply, you'll see the surface goes from the first curve I selected to the second curve I selected to the third curve. The surface will span in that order. Undo that and select them in a different order. Shift select the one down here second, this one third, and hit Apply. You can see the surface then lofts in that order. So make sure you select your curves in the correct order when you have more than 2 to get the right surface that you want. For example. Another thing to keep aware of is your curve, what's the right word? The number of spans in your curve. I'm just going to minimize this for a second and hit Control A for attributes. Because I duplicated this curve, all 3 curves are the same. So this curve has 10 spans, as well as this one, as well as this one. So whenever I loft, I'm going to delete that third one, just because. Select these 2, surfaces, loft. You'll see that the surface is nice and clean because the curves that I used have the same number of spans between them. If I select this curve, and I'm going to use the rebuild curve option here, and I'll have a video going over all the rebuild curve options in the future. But real quick, if I say number of spans, I'm just going to use this value of 4 and hit rebuild. You can see that my surface changes pretty dramatically because the number of spans between the 2 curves are different. This curve has 10 spans, this curve has 4. So whenever it creates the surface, it's not quite as clean. So one thing you might want to do when you're lofting between curves and you're getting these kind of ugly looking results is make sure your curves have a similar or same number of spans, if that's possible based on the project you're working on, of course. So to fix this, if I select this curve and go to Edit Curve, Rebuild, Options, and for now I'll just hit 10 for the number of spans, Rebuild, and then choose the 2 and create a loft. It's a little cockeyed just because the curve got manipulated with that rebuild options, but the surfaces are a lot more clean than they were before. So I'm going to undo back before all that stuff, before all the rebuilds and everything. so my spans are again equal. Go back to our options. So what does all this stuff do? First option is parameterization. We have uniform and chord length. Now this one is kind of subtle, and this is manipulating the UVs of the surface that it gets created. And again, it's very subtle. Hopefully I'll be able to show you just because it is so subtle. I'm going to create a new curve. Create CV curve tool, and it's going to be different on purpose just so it's hopefully visible what's happening. Alright, so my spans are probably very different. Let's see, this one's got 13 spans, this one has 10, 10. So if I select them in this order, edit, reset my settings, make sure they're all at default values, and hit apply, I get this crazy shape. Doesn't matter what it looks like really. I'm going to move it over to the side. So now I'm going to do this again and use chord length for my parameterization and apply. So the surfaces pretty much are the same. The geometry divisions of isoparms and all the lines are in the same places. You know, there's nothing different there. So if I go to Window, UV Texture Editor, this brings up the UV editor. And UV, as I've explained in other videos, is Maya's way of, and well, 3D's way of talking about 2D space. So you have 3D space, which is X, Y, and Z, which you can see down here in the lower left corner, X, Y, Z. Now when it's talking about 2D space, it uses U and V. And there is such thing as a 3D texture, like a 3D image that you can apply to an object. And in that case, they're going to say UVW to kind of mimic the XYZ of 3D physical space. But for 2D textural space, or for textures, they refer to it as UVs. And the chord length changes how the UVs are laid out on the surface that gets created with Loft. So if I choose between the two, you can see all these lines here, and it's very subtle. I'm going to zoom in on the difference. So you see that line that pops up right here is pretty much the difference, and I'm sure there might be some other subtle lines popping up that I'm not seeing, but in this particular case, the resulting difference between using chord length and uniform is very subtle. In your case, whenever you're creating like a character or something really complicated, you might get a very drastically different result. And I'm just trying to show you that using these simple shapes. But the chord length or uniform, and uniform I think is probably best, but it really depends on the situation. You might have to experiment with your particular project that you're using to see if chord length gives you a better result. But what it essentially does, uniform, which is what this one was, it tries to keep these UVs uniform, as in equally spanned in the UV editor here, while this one is not trying to do that. It's using the chord length of the surface math, which again I've established before in the past. I'm not very good at math, but it's using math. And in this particular case, the only difference is this line here that pops up in the middle of the UVs. It's different than that one. Kind of weird. Hopefully that explains a little bit about the difference. But let's move on. Let's go back to uniform. And I'm going to delete that curve in the middle here. Just back to these two. Next we have these two check boxes. We have auto reverse and close. Auto reverse is automatically on. Curves have direction. And because I duplicated this first curve, these two curves have the same direction. And you can change it. If I select this curve and go to Edit Curves, Reverse Curve Direction, nothing visibly changes, but the curve direction mathematically within Maya's brain is reversed from what it was before. So now when I choose to loft these two, if auto reverse is unchecked, I hit apply, you see I get this twisting shape. Auto reverse is nice to have on in case your curves are going in different mathematical directions. because when you choose to auto reverse, it will kind of automatically fix that problem. I did not fix the curve. The curve is still reversed from this curve, but because auto reverse is turned on, it will fix it and create a surface that is nice and smooth. So I typically leave that on just in case. I'm going to go ahead and reverse this back just to make sure I'm not messed up in the future. So then now they're both curves are now both going the same direction. And then close. If I again duplicate this curve, move it down here like before, and choose the 3 in this order and hit apply, we get this surface. But if I choose to close the surface, if I check the close box, you'll see that it will continue the loft past the 3 curves back to the original to try and close the surface into one solid shape. So that's handy for those cases where you're trying to get a complete surface and you don't want to have a 4th curve that's in the exact same spot as the first curve. So you can just choose this close option and it will automatically finish the surface. Then surface degree. We've talked about this before in other videos, but in case you didn't see those, surface degree options are linear and cubic. By default, it's turned on to cubic. You'll see that whenever I do these lofts, especially with this crazy curve shape, I get this really, oblong, rounded shape. That's using a cubic surface degree. And there are more degrees than just linear and cubic, but for the sake of this video, this option only has these 2 available. So I'm going to go just talk about those 2. Cubic gives you a rounding result. Delete this. And then use the same curve selection pattern. We'll use linear. Apply. You'll see they get straight line from one curve to the other using a linear surface degree. Go back to cubic. Section spans. I'm just going to use these first 2 curves again. Section spans by default is 1. If you increase this, it's pretty obvious what happens. You get more geometry divided between the 2 curves based on what you have in here. So section spans of 3, I get 3 spans between the 2 curves. Take that back to 1. In curve range, complete and partial. This is again similar to other tools I've talked about in the past, but with a curve range of complete, which is default, I get this result. I'll move that over here. And then with a curve range of partial, I get the same results. Almost. If I minimize my options here, I'll talk about the difference that happens. If I choose the first one and the second one, you'll see a very subtle difference in the channel box. This surface on the left was using a complete curve range. Surface on the right is using a partial curve range. And in the channel box for the partial surface, you have these 2 new objects appear, subcurve 1, subcurve 2, and based on how many curves you're using in your loft, if you have more than 2 curves that you're lofting between, you'll have more subcurves when you're using a partial curve range. Brain fart for a second. So with a complete curve range, you don't get the subcurves. So keep that in mind. I'm just going to delete this one since it doesn't have any bearing on what we're talking about. So this one with the partial curve range, I have my 2 subcurves based on my 2 curves that I used to create this surface. And within each of them I have a min-max value, by default 0 to 1. If I choose to decrease the max value less than 1, you'll see that the loft will apply only to a part of the first curve that I chose, which in this case, subcurve 1 associates with this first curve in the loft. If I go to subcurve 2 and choose to increase the min value, there we go, you'll see that it will choose to loft between this portion of the second curve. So you can choose along the curves that you've used to loft between where the loft happens using a subcurve and a partial curve range. Going back to subcurve 1, if I increase the min value, I can have the loft occur, let's see here, like right here in this section, and then for subcurve 2 I can choose to have it loft right here in that one. So you get, approximately right here. So I can just loft between a certain section of the curves rather than the entire curve I've made, which can be very useful. You can also animate these. I didn't say that before in my other videos. You can animate these if you wanted to animate something kind of growing into place. You can animate these subcurves, which could be cool. And then for output geometry, I have a video specifically going over polygon outputs, which is called convert NURBS to polygons, because it uses the same options here. You're converting NURBS to polygons command uses the same options as polygon outputs for these surfaces. So if you want to hear about all that stuff, please feel free to look at that video. I'll put a link right here to go to that video. Loft uses history just like every other thing in Maya. So if I real quick create a new curve, enter, and I'll duplicate it, hide my grid for now. So I have these two curves, and now surfaces, loft, make sure all my settings are reset, loft. So just like everything else, this has history. So if I select one of my original curves and move it, the surface will move with it. If I adjust the shape of the CVs of the curve, the resulting shape will also edit because of history. So if you don't get it right the first time, if the shape is not quite exactly how you want it, you can still go back and adjust these CVs of the curves and the surface will change, and hopefully you get it the way you want it. And another thing real quick I wanted to go over was that you don't have to use curves that you've created. You can also use components of other NURBS surfaces. Say a NURBS sphere. If I wanted to right click on the sphere and choose isoparm as my component selection method, I'll click that line here and then hold shift and click that line here down, these two isoparms selected. I can loft between these two isoparms and create a new shape. I'll go to surfaces, loft. Now I have this cylinder shape that was lofted between those two selected isoparms. So you don't have to use curves that you draw yourself. You can, if you have a shape that kind of creates the lines you need with the isoparms, you can definitely use those. Which you can also loft between an isoparm that's not even there. Like for example, just then, if I right click isoparm on my sphere, click and drag, you can choose a spot on the sphere that there's not an isoparm there, but you're indicating this as a spot on the sphere you want to use. Hold shift, click and drag to another spot. So I have these two locations on the sphere selected. Go to surface, loft, and it will definitely still loft between those two lines that you've indicated on the sphere. And because of history, if you adjust the sphere, the resulting lofts will change because those original surfaces are changing. And one more thing real quick. Just going to choose two isoparms again to loft between. The surfaces, loft, options, and make sure my curve range is partial. Hit loft, and just like before, and drag it over here so you can see, you can go over here in the channel box and you have, instead of subcurves, you have curve from surface with min and max values, which does the same thing essentially, but I wanted to show you that if you go use the show manipulator tool over here on the left, when you have this curve from surface selected in the channel box, you get this nifty handle over here on the original surface. It has a little blue diamond shape that you can click and drag on, and you can use that as the control handle. Instead of having to deal with numbers over here for min and max values, you can simply just click and drag these handles. That's using curve from surface number 1, the top one. Let's use the second one now and do the same thing. And you can see how you can adjust this really easily without necessarily having to deal with what exactly the numerical value is of the spot you're wanting to get. So that's using a partial curve range, lofting between isoparms on a NURB surface. But anyway, that's been Loft. I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please subscribe if you want to. If you liked it, definitely let me know. Comment. I'm always open to suggestions for future videos. And thank you very much for watching.